Morning, everybody. How y'all doing today? I first want to respond to my friend Ken McCall's video yesterday. Uh, he's right on. He's right on that when you start attributing the term jazz to so many other things that might have influence from jazz but aren't truly jazz, you do diminish the body of work created by the great artists. It's People take offense to it for some reason. I'm a little confused why. Uh, I feel like I've discussed it a lot here, that it's the struggle of that era that makes what those black men have to say so powerful, and what makes later eras feel very different. Even a black kid coming from a college degree at a music school making cutting edge sounding jazz, he's going to be emoting from a different place, and desperation versus achievement and ego are different sounding fuels. I've done episodes on that before. Even the simplest blues-based jazz of the 50s, Eddie Lockjaw Davis, basic, simple, straightforward, blowing, that cat's still expressing his experience. And anybody, when you come to a piece of art, you can either just appreciate it for what it is, or you can try to peer into that art to understand what the artist is trying to tell us. And to me, that's the whole point of art, is trying to get to know what the artist is saying. And it requires some intellect to dive into their personality and their experience and their environment, and knowing what history is impacting them and what's the condition of their experience. Those things are all so important in understanding what Tchaikovsky, what Beethoven, what Shakespeare, what Mark Twain had to say. It's always a commentary on the times. The Bible is a commentary on the experience of a people going through the wilderness, looking for a promised land. And if you don't think jazz players from the 50s and 60s weren't looking for a promised land, you're not listening, you're not hearing it. And to say that the later era cats who came along were saying and coming from that same place, it's delusional. It's just not the case. Even Hancock, as great a player as he is, he's fueled definitely by his intellect, his ego, his ability. Incredible player. Incredibly compositionally strong and savvy. But the compositions become the focus versus me just expressing what's on my soul and my mind and my heart and getting it off my chest. And instead, we got to listen to where the changes are, know the chords, and this composition is the center focus. And guys got to learn the changes. And Lockjaw's not trying to come into a studio and learn the chords and changes. He wants to say, I know this song really well, let me play it because I'm going to express some things on top of it. Like a hip hop, like an MC in a hip hop group, he wants to kick a freestyle about what's on his mind right now. And he doesn't want a bunch of complex new beats that change timbre and change and have these different times. Like, that's not, he just wants to get it off his chest. That's it. And so, Ken, you're absolutely right. Those people want to argue and debate about it. I don't know how you can tell me you hear the same fuel in a George Howard or an Earl Klug record from the 80s. It's just, it is what it is. And like and buy what you want to like and buy. But you can't ignore the greats of this music, the sacrifices they made, and thus the potency of that era. And I can't help but listen to black jazz from the 40s, 50s, and 60s and not think about the history and the social constructs. You put me into some avant-garde maze, and I'm thinking of a whole different... That never crosses my mind. And all the great white cats who I love, and I post their records on my Facebook groups all the time, not once do I listen to any of those records by the great white players and sit back and start contemplating the experience of the black American. Or even the white... It's a much more... This guy seems to be thinking about drugs or pussy or whatever. It's not to say there's not great white players. As I've said endlessly, there's many great white players. It's not to say there's not people who can't still interpret jazz today. But the legacy of those great men from that era, it was built in blood and housed in the tears of the sorrow of generations of struggle. And this was a people first finding freedom, first grasping at the strands of a new tomorrow. And the sacrifices Armstrong and Ellington and Basie and Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald made in the 30s and the 40s opens up the door for this next generation of cats in the 50s and 60s to come along and to be more militant and to demand more than what their father's generation asked for. And Armstrong asked for more than what his father's generation asked for. Every generation expects a little bit more freedom, a little bit more liberty, a little bit more acceptance, tolerance, coexistence. They're not asking for the stars. They're not saying we all want to be the president. It's simply saying, I want to feed my family, get to work and back without being harassed. I'll stay in my own neighborhood if I have to, if it keeps you from hassling me. I mean, they're incredibly passionate about it in so many ways. Still to this day. Still to this day. So, I'll move on, but good job, Ken. All you people who are arguing it and want to talk about the semantics of it, hear the sorrow, hear the ache. And then put on something from the 80s, the 90s, whatever, and tell me what you're thinking. What's it making you think about? What's it making you feel? You're not hearing ache. I don't know what you're hearing, but it might as well be dragons slaying fire-breathing anteaters. It's a very different thing. It's a very different thing. Today we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the newest Tone Poet. But first I want to talk about this. This is the great Sonny Rollins. And we just did my Blue Note 1500 series. And I played this record a couple days in a row. And I hadn't probably played it in a couple years. And it was just shocking to me the difference in color and palette between the songs that Monk led in this session versus the ones that Horace Silver leads. And they both are wonderful, and they both have a place, but they sound contextually very different. And Monk is such a strong sender of his personality and his experience and his composition that he impacts everyone in the band around him. And you hear the horns on this track and the other one on the other side. There's two songs that Monk are on. And it's weird having Monk and Rollins group here in 56. But Rollins and Monk worked together earlier at Prestige, and it was probably him returning a favor. Rollins and Monk were probably similar in exposure by 56, 57. Rollins probably even had a little bit of a head start. But J.J. Johnson's also incredible. Listen to that. That's dissonant. There's some edge to what Rollins does here. J.J. Johnson as well. J.J. at numerous times on this record just blew my socks off. I was just like, damn. His dexterity. He does these like double time things that are just like, I couldn't begin to do that. I couldn't begin to move a trombone valve and control my breath in such a way to make this precise machine gun like rhythm come out of my trombone. John Johnson was a genius. He really was. He goes back to the bebop era, and he's as great at what he does as the Blakeys on the drums, the Monks on the pianos, the Parkers on the altos, Dizzy on the trumpet. He's just a real innovator. And of course, Jimmy Cleveland, Curtis Fuller, other great trombonists come along and kind of borrow some of what he innovates. But there's no question that J.J. Johnson's very much the blossoming of the trombone in the 50s. And I think he's somewhat burdened by his legacy at Columbia with Kai Winding. He goes to Columbia, and in 54, 55, 56, they make a number of really great selling records that cross over into white America, had great distribution. Those records aren't expensive. You can find them in retail shops and pawn shops and thrift stores for $5. And I think that makes a lot of collectors today go, oh, this can't be any good. And they are great records, and they'd probably be even better if they weren't limited by the Columbia reach and management of what we're trying to accomplish here. Some of them are a little schmaltzier than others. USA Dance Party kind of, let's appeal to the young white kids kind of thing. But still, JJ is an incredible player whose success and ability leads him to a big stage. He's at Columbia before Miles, before Monk, before Mingus, before Blakey. He's one of the first black guys that really crosses over from this crop of talent and gets that national stage. And there's so much material done by Johnson and Winding, some together, some separately. And the relationship doesn't last as long as you would think. It seems like they're together throughout the 50s into the 60s. That's not true. They're together for about 3 years, not even. And Columbia has sessions they keep adding that they put out in 57, 58, 59. And then Bethlehem, Savoy both put out a K and JJ session. And that has some distraction to it where you're thinking, okay, these guys are together forever. But those sessions are also from that same time frame, 54, 55. And the Savoy one might even be earlier. And then, of course, Impulse, when they launch, Creed Taylor convinces JJ and Kai to reunite. And so they come together to make that great record. Kai Winding makes another record really right off the bat. And so, as a new collector, you see all this JJ Johnson, Kai Winding thing, and it looks like they're together for a long time. But it's really more sporadic and off and on. But they just sold really well, and Columbia kept releasing the stuff that they had recorded. And like I said, they do reunite a few times. And so there's the appearance of them being inseparable, but that certainly wasn't the case throughout the 50s and definitely not into the 60s. But JJ's a great player, and there's many times on this record where he's the one blowing my socks off. But again, Monk's impact here is so interesting on the people around him. This is a silver track. It's just much more straight. The opener here, just driving, good, hard bop, feeling, And then we're going to switch over to the second side here. And again, it's just fantastic stuff. This is Reflections. Monk, courtesy of Riverside Records. Listen to that. Rollins is playing these minimal little blurts and honks. It's just kind of, it's interesting how jazz allows a player to adapt and graft onto who's kind of, I don't want to say leading the session, but I don't think Monk can be part of a session and not kind of be leading it in some ways. He's a very strong sender, as Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks once said. Again, there's the silver stuff. Poor Butterfly at the end here is fantastic. But there's some JJ right there. But this is a great record. I don't think I quite realized just the impact that Monk had on the tracks he was on. And listening to it this time, it really kind of jumped out just how different those Monk tracks sounded. So we're going to talk about the new Tone Poet. And it's a great Lee Morgan record. The Raja. Recorded in '66, if I recall. Much better cover than the other cover that it had. Lee Morgan, Billy Higgins, Hank Mobley, Cedar Walton's on the piano. So it's a pretty serious lineup. Paul Chambers is on the bass. This is recorded right at the end of the Blue Note label legacy before they sell to Liberty. And this might not be a popular thing to say. It's a little more listless, I feel like, than some of the earlier work that they do. What's going on in there, I'm not sure. It's still a great session. And if this was on Prestige or some of the other labels, this would be a high watermark. But for me, and I still think it's fantastic. But I think I can feel a little bit why this one was shelved and not put out initially right away. it just has... Morgan seems a little softer there, a little bit... I don't know. It just doesn't grab me quite the same way as most of Lee Morgan's work does. And I've listened to it 4 times, and it hasn't really raised my eyebrows a ton. It hasn't throat grabbed me a ton. That's not to say it's not a piece worth grabbing, because for $25, any tone poet that's got Blue Note artists on it's always worth grabbing. I'm just saying it's not one of the best records Morgan and Mobley do together, but that's a pretty high bar that we're talking about. There's some fantastic Morgan right there. But that being said, it's a great session. It sounds great. The packaging is absolutely wonderful. There's some tone poets coming down the pike that I am kind of excited about. There's a Sonny Clark record that I've never been able to collect. Only has Japanese issuing, I think it's up to this point. That's coming, I think, in the midsummer. And then come around fall, there's I think it's around November. There's a couple of releases I'm kind of excited about. I think one of them's a Mobley session that I don't have, and the other one's maybe a Morgan again. But there were 2 records that I know that maybe Jackie McLean. McLean has a lot of records from 65, 66 that didn't, 67 that didn't get issued right away. Jackknife, there's a number of them, probably 4 or 5. So there's actually a ton of tone poet stuff that they'll be able to issue, those hard to find titles that were never issued in the official sequence for a long time to come. And that's a great thing. And of course they're still reissuing the actual titles from the actual series as well. So you issue a couple of the harder to find original titles, plus you mix in these harder to find posthumous release titles. There's going to be a ton of tone poet to come. And Liberty, of course, also bought Pacific Records. And so they're starting to mix in some interesting Pacific record titles, which I'm also excited about. Pacific's one of the best, probably my favorite West Coast jazz label. I have over 120 Pacific records, and it's a pretty high standard. Pacific, of course, was a white label, mostly white artists. And so their distribution and their budgets were far greater, and they're far easier to find than old Blue Notes are. But Pacific still was a mid-major label at best. And so those records are still tough to come by. And so getting this nice deluxe reissuing of some of that stuff will be exciting. And it's nice to see Pacific Records getting some love, which is long overdue. Again, OJC, which was distributed by Fantasy, was Fantasy having bought up a bunch of great jazz labels in the 60s and the 70s, into the 80s, and then they're reissuing it all under one umbrella OJC series. And so Contemporary had its following, Fantasy, of course, so many of the great labels, Prestige, Riverside, Jazzland, Debut. There's just a lot of fantastic stuff that's being reissued by OJC that throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s that made that stuff very commonplace in a lot of ways. So you saw Contemporary stuff a lot from LA, but LA's counterpart was Pacific, and because it was bought by Liberty Records and not Fantasy Records, the Blue Note stuff and the Pacific stuff was always tougher to come by. And of course Scorpio and Classic Records and other Japanese issue a lot of that Blue Note stuff because the Blue Note stuff was always in demand, and more so now than ever. But the Pacific stuff, has never had quite the same demand for it, in part because it did sell better, making there more old copies out there to be collected, to be rebought by people. And so a lot of the Pacific stuff hasn't gotten the same exposure, the same glory shone on it. And so it means a lot of people have kind of overlooked a lot of that great stuff on Roy Hart's Pacific Records label. It's a great label, and I'm excited to see Tone Poet add more. And they, of course, did that Gil Evans New Wine Old Bottle, or Old Wine New Bottle, what is it? With Cannonball Adderley. That was reissued last year, and that's a great record. And that record has a couple different covers in the original format on Pacific, so be careful when you're buying anything Gil Evans on Pacific. Is probably that record with 2 or 3 different covers. But it's a great record all the same. Adderley is fantastic on that. But I'm excited about a new in-depth series I'm working on. I'm working on a series on the great guitar players of the 50s and 60s. And that's something I covered probably about a year ago, but we're going to go on a bit of a different direction with it this time. And I've added some stuff to the collection since then. I've added some insights into the whole guitar aspect. And I'm also going to add 2 great guitar jazz playlists to these 2 videos, maybe even 3. And I think one's going to be a history piece, and then the next 2 videos will be the first playlist and the second playlist. One's going to be kind of an up-tempo guitar playlist, 35-40 songs, and the other one's going to be kind of a down-tempo guitar playlist. Again, 35-40 songs, covering these 40 or so jazz guitar players from this era. A question I do have is, what's the best format for you guys to click on a playlist? Spotify's what I've used, and I've had a few people say it's not quality enough for their listening, and so it needs to be on, and I can't recall what they said. I'm not super digitally handy. When I stream, I just put on Pandora, one of my few stations there, and let that play in the background on my Sonos if I don't have time to play records. But for the most time when I listen to jazz, I'm listening to my vinyl. I got too much of it not to. You know, I also will say sometimes people share stuff with me to watch. Click on this link and watch this. And most of the time I got records playing, and I hesitate to get up and turn something off to go watch a video because I'm already in the middle of a record. And then by the time I get to the end of that record, I've kind of forgotten. So I often don't see things people ask me to watch. But that's something I try to go back and find if I can, but it doesn't always work that way. So I'm excited about the jazz guitar series. I have a few things coming in the mail that I had to have for this series as well. Hopefully it won't be like the Savoy record where it got lost and we had to wait 3 weeks for me to put that out. But it's going to be more in depth like the Savoy, like the Blue Note 1500 series, where we're going to do some photos, take pictures of a lot of records, put some slides together, and give us kind of an in-depth history of jazz guitar and the great players. And then again, those playlists I think are going to be fantastic. The melancholy down-tempo one is going to be blissful and just euphoric and kind of melancholy, chill. And guitar players, there's definitely 2 sounds to every guitar player. When a guitar player is playing slow tempo versus up tempo, some guitar players excel at one versus the other, and they can sound often very different at different tempo, more so than I think horn players. Horn players at different tempos can variate, but I think guitar players versus slow tempo versus up tempo can often illustrate very different tendencies and stylings. And some guys are just great playing really slow. Other guys aren't as strong at that. But we do kind of cover a pretty wide swath of great guitar players. I've been doing a lot of little research, digging stuff out, pulling records out. I spent a lot of time pulling records. But like I said, my wife says I'm playing with my toys. We got a nice little snowstorm heading here right now. So I'll probably spend most of the day today in my record room doing research for that episode. We got a Throat Grabbers coming up soon. I got 3 guests on that one. I'm looking forward to putting that one out there. And there's a lot of cool ideas I got on my list of episodes to come. Some of you all suggested some great stuff. Some of it's just ideas I've been having. I'm trying to at least once or twice a month do something that's a little bit more in depth as a series with more elaborate backgrounds, more research, more information, and those are going to be a little bit more study guides and something that hopefully people can search YouTube and find these and have them as resources. I'm especially trying to do the stuff that doesn't have volumes of material out there, like the Savoy stuff. I want to do Bethlehem BCP series, all 81 of them. I have all of those. That one's very soon to come. I got a bunch of more Jazz Universe stuff where we did that Basie one. I want to do a number of other guys there just to illustrate the sprawl of some of the great jazz universes. I got a pretty exciting list of stuff that's coming down the pike. So y'all stay tuned. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters. If you haven't had time to reach out and support me on Patreon, as little as $5 a month would be appreciated to help us through this tough time if you got it. If you don't want to do the Patreon thing, you still want to help, go to my jazz merchandise in the link and grab a hoodie or a t-shirt. There's some revenue there for us as well, me and my family. That's always appreciated. I've been watching a lot more YouTube lately. All kinds of different things, from history to geography to politics to music to jazz. And boy, most channels sure ask for money more than I do. And so it's not something I want to make a focus on my channel. I don't want to sit around talking about money. And a lot of these channels now have 5-minute commercials where the guy's sitting there talking about a product for the first 5 minutes because they were sponsored. And I hope I never become that guy. And boy, I just want it to be about the music. And I think my channel is always going to be kind of a niche thing. It's never going to be a viral thing. It's speaking to a certain demographic. And for the most part, it scares away people who aren't kind of in line with that way of thinking, and I'm okay with that, honestly. You'd like to preach to more than just the choir. You'd like to have some converts and feel like you're reaching a new audience. But at the same time, I'm not in a hurry to have a bunch of people subscribe to the channel that aren't really invested or don't really care about jazz or just want to argue that race isn't a factor. I don't have time for that shit. So the new Tone Poet, it's good stuff. It really is. This second song here, the Raja, is a great little track. There's some great stuff on side 2 as well. Dava Samba, I thought was a neat little track, and Once in a Lifetime is beautiful. So again, it's classic Blue Note. Probably not the best Mobley Morgan record. That's just my honest opinion. But Mobley and Morgan on their worst days are better than most jazz cats on their best. And so it's still a very noteworthy session. It's great to hear Billy Higgins with them. And of course, Cedar Walton and Paul Chambers are always fantastic. And it's weird that they didn't give Paul Chambers a photograph there. You'd figure that as many sessions as Paul Chambers was on at Blue Note, there'd be plenty of photographs of Paul Chambers to go around. I think there was another Tone Poet record where there wasn't a picture of Chambers, if I recall. I'm not sure on that. But anyway, y'all be safe. I got some cool stuff coming. Stay tuned to the channel. Appreciate you all. My name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Thanks again, Ken, for the shout out. Any new subscribers, welcome to the channel. There's a lot of back catalog of stuff because I do episodes quite a lot. I've been working this whole year, so I've been making jazz episodes. So if you have time, dig through some of that old stuff. There's some good stuff in there, but there's enough content coming out that it can keep you busy as well. So y'all be safe. Talk to you soon. Peace.